How cold is too cold for your horse? Hello and welcome back to Uplift Equine. And I know the first thing that you're going to ask once you start to have the snow start falling in your area or the wind start getting a little bit chilly if you're in Florida, for instance, and those iguanas falling out of those trees. The first thing that you're going to ask is, how cold is too cold for your horse to work? And that can be a very mixed answer. For some of us, winter has just arrived here in Indiana. For others, it is currently in full swing if you're living in somewhere like Montana. But that question still remains: how cold is too cold? How cold is so cold that we damage their lungs or they start to colic or worse? Many of these thoughts can run through your mind, and when we think about training in the cold, or for some, none of them. But the idea of cold is relative for many of us, relative to what we're acclimated to. But there is a way to tell by looking at basic biology. But before I move on with this, I want to thank my students for basically sponsoring this particular video by hiring me as their trainer. So if you live in the central Indiana area and you would like to have a trainer to travel to you and help teach you how to teach your horse, so I coach you on how to train your horse while teaching you how to be a better rider on top of that, and I travel to you, so if you like that idea, please contact me with the email down below, and it will also be in the comments. But if you do not live in central Indiana area and still like that idea, please contact me through the same email address for any kind of online lessons. But continuing, cold is relative to where you live. Riders in Florida may start to shiver at 50 degrees. Whereas riders in Minnesota, however, might not think twice about riding when the thermometer reads 0 Fahrenheit. Meteorologically speaking, the cold weather is generally defined as temperatures of 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Wind, snow, and ice will make that effect a little bit colder or a little bit worse. Exercising in cold weather affects your horse in many ways. Bodily systems react in different ways. Most research exercising in the cold weather has been done on human subjects, but there has been studies on the effects of cold air on equine pulmonary function. Horses are actually used as an animal model for pulmonary research in humans, since the equine pulmonary function is similar to humans. A series of experiments were performed at Oklahoma State University investigating the deleterious effects of strenuous cold weather exercise on airway function in horses. These studies were designed to mimic the conditions cold weather has on human athletes, such as skiers experience. Many skiers developed cold-induced asthma, often called skier's asthma. This occurs due to the acute airway obstruction when cold air gets down into the lungs and damages tissues. Inspired air is air-conditioned or warmed and humidified by the upper airways to prevent cooling and desiccation of the lung parenchyma. Although this process is usually successful, under severe conditions such as strenuous exercise in frigid environments, unconditioned cold and dry air penetrates into the peripheral airways. The OSU equine study, horses were exercised on a treadmill while breathing chilled 4 degrees Celsius or 39.2 Fahrenheit air. After exercising, a bronchoalveolar lavage was performed to test inflammation, cytokines, or chemicals that can damage the lungs, and chemicals that can suppress immune function in the lungs and lead to infection. The horses that exercise in cold weather and experience peripheral airway mucosal injury due to the penetration of unconditioned air. Furthermore, These results suggest that airway cooling and desiccation may be a factor in airway inflammation commonly found in equine athletes. Results of this study support the hypothesis that exercising while breathing cold, dry air alters the airway cytokine profile. The study did not find an increase in inflammatory cells, but as cellular response takes longer to occur, this study may not have been long enough for it to occur. These results support the contention that exercise while breathing cold air can actually contribute to the development of asthma. The data further raises the possibility of local suppression of cell-mediated immunity, thought the increased expression of interleukin 10. So, for the lungs, what affects the horse's ability to breathe and whether or not it is damaged in cold air. So the lungs, basically the takeaway message from these studies are that horses' lungs can be damaged when strenuously exercised in cold, dry temperatures. If the temperature gets really cold, keep the exercise light to prevent pulmonary problems, especially if your horse has heaves. So basically, light exercise is exercise that does not require a lot of inspired air. So it's still exercise that can warm your horse, that can work their muscles, but it doesn't require them to have very deep breathing. So extended cantering, times of extended cantering or times of jumping, I would say keep everything to a ground pull level in the certain temperatures. I say certain temperatures because I wouldn't say, okay, no jumping unless it's above 50 degrees, but I would say no jumping unless it's above 30 degrees and not dry. But it just depends on what kind of jumping that you're doing. Are you doing low hunter? Are you doing high jumper? What are you doing? So that is also a huge factor in what kind of exercise your horse does. I like to kind of leave it at, do we do halt work and walk work today? Do we do just ground work? Do we do trot work? Do we do transitions? Because transitions get your horse's muscles moving without really getting them into pulmonary distress. And I say that with a grain of salt because too many transitions, if you do it too extreme, then they start getting into pulmonary distress because their muscles are working so much that they need that extra oxygen. So it's really a kind of like a art of deciding what to do in cold weather. But, so for the cardiovascular system, so the heart and blood vessels, react to cold by increasing blood pressure and heart rate. It also reduces the amount of blood that flows closest to the skin in order to preserve core body temperature. The reduced blood flow to the skin can lead to frostbite. This lack of blood leads to the eventual freezing and death of skin tissue that is affected in these areas. Again, it is probably wise to reduce the intensity of your ride so that your horse's heart does not have to work so hard. So, seeing this, your horse's heart is working at a certain level when it is cold because they're trying to just keep warm at their, state. If you work it even harder, you are working the cardiovascular system even more on top of that because they are not in a true resting position when they are trying to stay warm. They are in a kind of altered resting position where their body is resting but their heart is still pumping quite a bit instead of, say, in a true resting position, say at 60 degrees and, they're sleeping. So knowing this, having strenuous activity in cold weather can affect their heart in that way. So that's also something to be aware of. The musculature and joints. So the muscles take longer to warm up in the cold weather, and arthritic joints may ache and need more time to loosen up. If you are riding, even if you are riding less than you do in the warmer months, don't stop any joint supplements that normally help your horse. Extremely important. He will need them just as much, if not more, in the cold weather. You can also consider a quarter sheet to cover your horse's hindquarters during riding. This will help keep some heat in without being restrictive, especially if your horse's body is clipped. This brings up the question of whether or not to clip whether or not to body clip, basically. If your horse gets sweaty when ridden, it is probably a good idea to do so, some sort of body clip to help cool him out quicker. A sweaty horse will get very cold in cold weather if not properly cooled out and dried off. There are many types of clips to choose from, and that is right for you, your horse, and your situation. So, and it depends on, and body clipping really depends on your climate of where you are at. So the growth of hair on the horse is not per climate, it is per amount of sunlight that hits the horse's eyes. So if your horse's eyes are damaged in one way or another, or if you're in a warmer climate but it still gets darker in the winter, the horse will still create a nice warm winter blanket or a warm winter coat. Sometimes body clipping is best because if your climate is still pretty warm but your horse's coat is ready for way colder, then body clipping is a thing. Just make sure that that skin is covered with blanketing when you are not using the horse, because as that horse really lets heat out effectively when working, it also lets heat out effectively when not working. So that skin is no longer protected by that nice layer of thick fur that they grow for winter. So please keep that in mind, because the other 23 hours of the day that you are not working your horse, that horse is possibly suffering and likely their skin may start getting damaged depending on how cold it is and how unblanketed the horse is. Because if they are left in a stall, they also do not have enough room in that stall to effectively move around to warm themselves. Just so you know. This goes kind of hand in hand with how, depending on your climate, how much should you work your horse? Should you work your horse up into a sweat if your climate is like Indiana, where it is below freezing for a good portion of the winter and not really above freezing until the spring? Because the question remains, because if your horse is working itself up into a sweat, that means you are working its lungs and cardiovascular system more. And is that more too much more? That is a big question. Let's move on to energy and calories. So, exercising in cold weather uses more energy than in warmer weather. Glycogen stores, so glucose stored in the liver, is used up 5 times faster in the cold weather. Once this is used up, the body starts to convert fat for energy, which is less efficient. Make sure that any horses that will be working hard in cold weather are receiving an adequate amount of calories. So remember, the calorie replacement is going to be way different than in warmer weather. And especially if your horse is out on pasture and you rely on that pasture to keep your horse in good condition, they, one, don't have that quality pasture out there because the plants are not growing. You know, if you live in more of the northern hemisphere or the way southern hemisphere during your winter months, they don't have that. And so if you're feeding them the same amount of feed, the same amount of hay, but then they don't have that pasture, they are receiving way less calories than they usually do on top of the cold, on top of working. So remember that calorie replacement in that situation will not be there. So please remember, your horse needs forage, and almost constant forage if they're living outside. So having good quality round bales that are lifted up off the ground is essential, because that means they can eat whenever they feel like they need to keep their core body temperature stable. Blanketing also goes into that, because the less blanketed your horse is past their threshold of like thermoregulation, the more calories that they will expend trying to keep themselves warm. So it depends on the horse. So like easy keepers such as cobs, cold bloods, etc. They tend to do better in the cold, given that they don't have any age-related or injury-related issues or illness-related issues. If they are just a healthy horse, an easy keeper is easy to keep in the winter as well, because they get those fat stores really easily, and then they can burn those fat stores somewhat more easily as well. So if your horse goes into the winter and is kind of fat and pudgy and you're like, I don't know, my horse's condition doesn't look great, don't worry. I would say monitor it. If you're extremely worried, ask a vet. But throughout the cold winter months, as they expend that energy staying warm, remember, they may kind of thin out towards the spring. If they are not thinning out towards the spring and they're still quite pudgy, that's when you should become a bit more concerned about their body condition. But anyway, that is not necessarily the focus of this particular video. But remember, energy and calorie replacement is way different in the winter than it is in the summer. So hydration. Water consumption should be carefully monitored in equine athlete who is working in cold weather. Dehydration occurs in cold weather just as much as it does in warm weather. Flavored electrolytes in feed or water may entice the horse to drink more if your horse is dehydrated. He will have reduced blood volume. That in turn will make it harder for his already hard-working heart to try to work harder to pump less blood. Make sure that your horse has plenty of fresh liquid and water around. A full frozen water trough does absolutely no good. Some horses prefer water warmed, so consider using trough and bucket warmers. And even if your horse seems to not appreciate the trough warmer as much, still keep it in there because it keeps the water liquid instead of solid. Because solid ice does not do your horse any good for hydration. I can tell you that. But yes, hydration is absolutely key importance. It's even more important in the winter because the horses tend to not feel like drinking as much in the winter. So that tends to make it a little bit more difficult to keep the horse hydrated. But as I said before, the electrolytes and flavored water tends to kind of entice them to drink it a little bit more often. I would add to that, before we move on, but I would add to that, and please offer your horse water before and after your work. It is extremely important. If they are hot after the work, please warm the water or wait until they are completely cooled off before offering them cold water. It can cause colic if the water is way too cold and the horse is way too hot. So be aware of that, but just because your horse is coming straight out of the field or straight out of the stall does not mean that they have drank water recently. Sometimes they see you coming and then they forget to drink anything, or it's been over an hour since they've drank anything and they haven't really thought about it. This happens to us all the time. But in the preparation for work, sometimes just offering that drink and maybe even getting them to drink or getting them to eat some like hay pellets with electrolyte in there, and then that will get them to want to drink some water. Anyway, their feet. So take care when there is ice and snow on the ground. Slippery conditions can lead to a whole host of musculoskeletal problems. If your horse is shod, consider snow pads and keep snow and ice from balling up from the bottom of his feet. Always pick out any snow or ice to help prevent slipping. Borium on the shoes can add traction as caulks if needed. Strenuous exercise in cold weather can be difficult on your horse, so common sense and information about how cold weather affects him will empower you to be able to create a cold weather exercise plan that will keep your horse fit, keep him happy and safe, and keep you in the saddle all winter long. So, we can more easily regulate ourselves because we know how our bodies work and feel, but we don't necessarily know exactly how our horse's body feels. We can take some clues off of their body language as long as we stay open to it and don't lose sight of your relationship with them. But never let constructed goals and desires get in the way of you and your horse's welfare. Because all of these things that happen to your horse in the cold also happen to you. So much of the time I tell my students, too cold isn't necessarily the problem with the horse when it comes to light activity, and sometimes having a light training session is good to kind of get the blood moving and then get return circulation on their legs a bit better if they're not moving around that much in the field. But like I said, keeping it light. Much of the time, from what I've experienced, is the weather gets too cold for us before it gets too cold for them when it comes to light activity. But if you are having trouble breathing the cold winter air, or if it's so windy that you can't breathe without putting some sort of mask on, balaclava, or scarf around your face, kind of consider that it's probably the same way with horses, because remember when I said earlier in this video that their pulmonary function is so similar to humans, that they use horses in studies for pulmonary function in humans? Just remember, if it is cold and dry for you and you're having trouble breathing, it is cold and dry for them and they're having trouble breathing. So get them, if you want to work them, get them out of the wind and working them in a very light way. If you don't have an indoor arena, like I don't have an indoor arena, but that's okay. I know exactly what to do in the winter. If you have a level ground, such as a hallway, and the hallway isn't currently being used by many other people, and it's of good grip, so you have like a rubber pad down, or if it's a dirt floor, you can do light halt work and walk halt transitions, and even a couple of steps of halt trot transitions if it's a long enough hallway with good footing. Please do not do this on concrete that is sweating. Not a good idea. But you can create your own little like winter training plan depending on how things are going. So like I said in the previous video on Blanket and Geek Out, their horses' thermoregulation and their thermoneutral zone, it is lowest at about 40 degrees. So underneath of that, they're going to start having some excess function issues, such as, cardiovascular rate will be higher just to stay warm. Their pulmonary function will be a little bit different. So just work with your trainer and make sure that your winter training program is good for you and your horse. I hesitate to put a, this covers all horses winter training plan online. I may or may not, but I hesitate to do that because every horse and rider's goals are so different, and every horse is so different that you kind of need some individual care and guidance in this particular situation. But thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about how cold is too cold for your horse. And please check out some other videos on blanketing and blanketing geek outs. And if you are looking for a birthday gift, I know I put out the gifts for equestrians video for over the holidays, but if you have a equestrian that you're trying to buy something for their birthday, you can check it out over here. So thank you for watching, and I appreciate you guys supporting me if you are on Patreon. If you have not considered Patreon, please check it out. The link is down below. And thank you for participating. Have a wonderful day.